is that these conditions are not genetic, okay? Type 2 diabetes is not something that you are born with. It's not something that you cannot do anything about. It is something that is a consequence of the way you're eating and the way you're living. And it's not your...
So in this clip, Glucose Goddess Jessie talks about how type 2 diabetes is not genetic. So is this true? It's not so black and white that individuals with certain variants will automatically get type 2 diabetes. That doesn't mean it's not genetic though. So I just did a really quick Google search and found these genes that can be impacted, that can have an effect on your metabolism, your physiology, make it more or less likely for you to have type 2 diabetes.
Before we get started, if you're not already, please go follow Miss Richie, because she's putting out some fantastic content. Let's talk a little bit about the genetics of type 2 diabetes. For some brief history, type 2 diabetes is the diagnosis of chronically elevated blood glucose. And unless you have a tumor inside of your pancreas that produces excessive amounts of the blood glucose raising hormone glucagon, the predominant cause of type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance. Insulin is a hormone released in response to elevated blood glucose, which typically occurs after a meal. And there are insulin receptors located on cells throughout the body, and when insulin binds, it stimulates these cells to uptake the glucose out of the bloodstream, lowering blood glucose levels. Insulin resistance is identified as the impaired biological response to insulin, meaning when glucose raises and insulin is released, cells do not respond properly by uptaking glucose out of the bloodstream. It remains chronically elevated, and we diagnose this as type 2 diabetes. Two of the most important causes of the insulin resistance that underlies diabetes is where your fat is stored and how your fat cells grow. What I mean when I say this is that visceral fat is much more strongly associated with whole body insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, compared to subcutaneous fat. Subcutaneous fat is the squishy, pinchable fat that lies right underneath the skin and is considered a safe form of fat storage, whereas visceral fat is fat located deeper in the abdominal cavity, located in and around the organs. In addition to where your fat is stored, how your fat cells grow also affects your risk of type 2 diabetes. It appears that hypertrophic fat cells are much more strongly associated with type 2 diabetes than hyperplastic fat cells. Although that sounds complex, these are two mechanisms of fat tissue expansion. Hypertrophy is when one single cell simply grows in triglyceride content and size. Hyperplasia is when more fat cells are produced, and we store the same amount of fat in multiple cells, and each fat cell is smaller. When fat cells grow via hypertrophy, they become more and more insulin resistant, more and more inflamed, and begin leaking fat into the bloodstream. Fat to be stored in places like the liver and the muscle known as ectopic fat, which causes these tissues to also become insulin resistant, worsening type 2 diabetes. These two findings motivated the development of the term the personal fat threshold, which is essentially the amount of body fat that you can safely store within the subcutaneous area without it beginning to cause substantial insulin resistance, based upon your capacity to store subcutaneous fat and your capacity to grow fat cells via hyperplasia rather than hypertrophy. At the most basic level, simply coming out of the womb with XY chromosomes means that at the same concentration of fat, you are much more insulin resistant than your female counterparts. This appears to be due to the fact that estrogen, which is far higher in healthy females than it is in males, stimulates fat cell hyperplasia, causing women to store more subcutaneous fat, whereas the androgens in men causes them to store more visceral fat. The second genetic predisposition is your ethnicity, as at the same levels of body fat, South Asians have a far greater prevalence of diabetes than do other ethnicities, and it appears that Caucasians can simply store much higher concentrations of body fat before they begin to develop type 2 diabetes than other ethnicities, which is in large part due to the predisposition to store visceral fat. However, understand that to date, we have identified 460 locations on the DNA related to fat distribution that can affect the risk of type 2 diabetes at the same body fat level. And everyone has their own individual personal fat threshold, which is why one individual may have perfectly good insulin sensitivity at 35% body fat, whereas their counterparts may develop diabetes at 30% body fat. Therefore, there is a genetic component to type 2 diabetes. However, very importantly, the most important factor for the development of diabetes, regardless of the person, is surpassing your personal fat threshold. And although it means that some people simply cannot put on as much body fat, because the mechanisms are the same whether you develop type 2 diabetes at 25% body fat or 35% body fat, the prevention of weight gain in the first place and weight loss once you have surpassed that personal fat threshold are the mechanisms by which you can prevent and or reverse type 2 diabetes. Therefore, type 2 diabetes is caused by the development of excess body fat in the first place. But what is excessive to different individuals depending on their genetics, race, and gender differs widely across the population.